Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
The moment the words were out of my mouth, I realized I'd made a mistake. A mistake that couldn't be taken back, especially in this situation and in front of his boss. My name is Danielle. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Fort Worth, Texas. This is the story of how a bad joke at a New Year's Eve company party turned my life upside down, and my marriage at the same time. Last Friday, my husband of 37 years, Troy, invited me to his company's New Year's Eve corporate party. Honestly, I didn't want to go. These events have always seemed awkward to me, and I didn't know how to interact with his coworkers. But Troy insisted, saying my presence was important to his reputation, and I agreed. If necessary, I'd play the role of the perfect wife for one night. I spent a lot of time on my hair and makeup, put on a green dress he particularly liked, and tried to look as presentable as possible, whatever that meant. As soon as we entered the hall, I sensed that it was going to be a challenging evening. People were smiling and talking, but I realized that all I could do was just keep the conversation going with nods and smiles. The first few hours passed quietly. We chatted with his coworkers, played some corporate quizzes. I had a couple of cocktails, and by dinner time, my mood started to improve. That's when Mr. Rick, Troy's boss, who he'd mentioned more than once back home, showed up. Troy often complained that he was too demanding and that he was always sitting on his neck. I expected to see a stern, gray-haired man with a grumpy expression, but Mr. Rick was nothing like that. Tall, trim, in his 40s, he looked elegant and confident. He seemed to fill the room with his mere presence. Suddenly, I realized why Troy was so nervous around him. Mr. Rick was the complete antithesis of my husband, who often doubted himself, especially in a professional setting. These were not Troy's candid words, but I knew him well enough to recognize these unspoken fears. Mr. Rick represented not just a boss, but an example of what Troy wanted to be, but feared he never would be. We sat around a large round table, me, Troy, his boss, and a few other employees. The atmosphere was relaxed, and the conversation flowed easily. The topics changed one after the other until we were talking about soccer. Troy is an avid Cowboys fan. He literally lives and breathes that team. But it turns out Mr. Rick is an Eagles supporter. If you know anything about soccer, you know that there is always tension between these two teams and their fans. They started bantering with each other, and I noticed the look in Troy's eyes. It was that look of his, the look of a man who's losing an argument but isn't ready to admit it. And that's when I couldn't help myself and opened my mouth. Leaning forward with a sly grin, I blurted out, "If you spend as much energy at home as you do on the Cowboys' defense, you might get something worthwhile out of life." For a moment, it was as if the entire room had been plunged into a vacuum. Even the sound of glasses was hushed. Mr. Rick broke in a loud laughter, slapping his palm on the table. "Well, there's truth in what she says, Troy." But my husband didn't find it amusing. His face remained stony, his gaze downcast. He didn't even dignify me with a response, just took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, as if trying to suppress his anger and not say something he'd regret later. His silence spoke louder than any words. I'd hit his weakest point, and I knew it now. I knew it was time to stop, but it wasn't me. I was being stubborn. I added, "Maybe if you were as diligent about our finances, we wouldn't be fighting over the cable bill every month." I smiled, thinking that sounded nice. But only awkward coughing sounds were heard around the table. Troy's knee suddenly touched mine under the table. It was his stop sign. But I ignored him. "Don't look at me like that," I declared with feigned indignation, tilting my head. "I'm just kidding. You understand, don't you?" I added, but he coldly cut me off. "No, Danielle, it's not a joke. You're taking this too far." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but every syllable of it was as dangerous as possible. The rest of dinner passed in strained silence. No one at the table made any attempt to keep the conversation going. Even the scraping of forks across plates was somehow quieter than usual. Troy barely looked in my direction, answering my questions with short, one-word sentences. I knew I should apologize, but instead I convinced myself he was just being dramatic. Later that evening, however, Mr. Rick returned to the topic again. "Danielle, you're a lot of fun," he said, patting Troy on the back. "She sure keeps you energized and doesn't let you relax." But Troy didn't laugh. He only nodded briefly and said, "Yeah." And that's when it hit me. It wasn't just a joke. I just ruined his attempt to impress the person most important to him, Mr. Rick. After dinner, the plan was to continue the evening at the bar. Troy, not even bothering to ask my opinion, just threw on his coat, turned to me, and said abruptly, "Let's go." I gave a strained smile, waved at everyone, and muttered something like, "Oh, looks like it's time to go home, huh?" No one laughed, though someone tried to maintain the strained atmosphere. We walked out, and silence enveloped us from the moment the door closed behind us. All the way home, he drove sharply, heavy foot on the gas pedal, eyes staring ahead, jaw clenched. I sat next to him, trying to look indifferent, scrolling through the feeds on my phone, but out of the corner of my eye, I kept noticing the way he was holding himself back so he wouldn't explode. When we pulled up in front of the house, I decided to break the silence. "Are you seriously mad because it was just a joke?" I uttered, trying to smooth over the corner. He stayed where he was for a few seconds, holding onto the steering wheel. His breathing became measured, like he was trying to find the last shreds of calm. Then he turned to me, looking straight into my eyes, and said quietly but firmly, "No, Danielle, this isn't about the joke. It's about you. I'm tired of this. I'm sick of it." Troy jumped out of the car, slamming the door loudly, and walked into the house. He didn't even look back, didn't wait for me at the door like he usually did. I stayed in the car, discouraged by his words. Half angry, half puzzled, I tried to figure out what exactly I had done wrong. "It's just a joke," I kept repeating to myself. Men joke with each other like this all the time. Why is it that when I do it, everything changes? Finally, I got out of the car and walked into the house, ready to continue the argument. But he wasn't in the living room. I went upstairs, still on my heels, and found him in the bedroom. He was packing his things into a travel bag. "What are you doing?" I exclaimed, resting my arms at my sides. "Where are you going?" Troy didn't answer right away. He zipped up the bag, then turned to me with a tired but firm look in his eyes. "I'm done, Danielle. I'm leaving." I laughed, thinking it was just a ridiculous joke. "You're not going anywhere because of some stupidity," I stated confidently. But without a word, he walked past me, heading downstairs. I followed him, still trying to gain the upper hand in the argument. "You're ridiculous," I said, crossing my arms. "If you want to be a fool, be one." He walked to the door, turned to me, and said the words that hit me the deepest. "You're so stupid you never know when to stop, Danielle. That's your problem." After that, he left. I stood at the door, staring into the void, hoping he would turn around. My phone was in my hand, half expecting a text or call, but there was nothing, just the sounds of silence. I locked the door, as if that would make any difference, and leaned against it, crossing my arms and biting my lip. "He'll come back," I urged myself. "He always comes back." I went upstairs, still in the same green dress. My heels thumped loudly on the floor. I sat on the edge of the bed, where the pillow still held the dent from his head. Instead of sadness, irritation swept over me. He was being so dramatic. I grabbed my phone and texted him. "Where are you? Are you okay?" There was no response. Okay. If he decided to play hardball, I could too. Looking in the closet, I noticed that his travel bag was indeed gone. He took it like he was going on a trip, I thought with a chuckle. My first thought was to call his mom. He hated it when I did that, but I held back, knowing she'd probably take his side. Instead, I dialed my sister Rachel. She answered on the third beep. "How are you?" she asked. I sighed, plopping down on the bed. "Troy is being stupid." "What did you do this time?" came through with a slight laugh in her voice. It hit me. "Why do you always think it's me?" I asked, feeling insulted. "Because it usually is, Danielle," she replied calmly. I told her everything. The party, the joke, the scene at the table. I tried to make it sound like it wasn't serious, just a playful prank. But her voice grew softer and more serious. "You said that in front of his boss?" Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt the truth coming up. "You said it in front of his boss?" Rachel's question sounded so harsh that I tensed involuntarily. "Yeah, so what?" I snapped at her, irritated that she wasn't even trying to take my side. I wasn't lying, just stating the obvious. "He's always complaining about how stressed out he is at work. Maybe if he didn't dwell on it, he'd be less irritable. Danielle, Rachel interrupted me, her voice hard, almost cold. You disrespected him in front of his boss. Men don't forget things like that. You made him look insignificant. I was silent for a moment, feeling her words hang heavy in the air. Well, it was just a joke, I said, breaking the silence. He laughed, didn't he? Rachel asked. Laughing? I asked with uncertainty in my voice, but I answered, no. Then it's not a joke. Rachel's fame sounded like a judgment. I hate it when she says things like that. They always make too much sense. But I wasn't about to give up, so I hurried to change the subject. He left, packed a bag, and that was it? Rachel asked incredulously when I told her what had happened. He left, I confirmed dryly, tossing my pillow across the room. He's got something on his mind. He was the one throwing a tantrum, not me. Danielle, you could fix that, she said quietly. You know Troy's not the type to bluff like that. He'll be back, I muttered, more to myself. But for the first time, I doubted my words. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every rustle outside the window made me check my phone, hoping to see his message. But the phone was silent. The hours dragged agonizingly slow. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Still not a single call, not a single text. By 3 in the morning, I was walking around the house, grumbling softly under my breath, as if I were arguing with him, even though he wasn't even close. I replayed the evening's events over and over in my head, trying to justify myself. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. But no, he was a grown man, he could handle a few words. I finally fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up in the morning to the sound of birds chirping and my phone vibrating. For a moment, I thought it was him, but it was just a message from Rachel and still no word from Troy. I stood up, stretched, and checked the call log and saw nothing. Well, no, I'm not calling him, I told myself firmly. But as time passed, my confidence began to wane. By noon, I was standing at the kitchen counter, tapping my fingernails on the countertop, wondering if I should call after all. I hated making the first move, but pride seemed to be becoming too much of a burden. Where could he have gone? I thought, and anxious thoughts began to swarm in my head. I made up my mind. I dialed his number. 2 beeps, and it went to voicemail. Yeah, so that's what we're doing now, I muttered, shaking my head. 2 days passed. Nothing. I started to wonder if he was staying at one of his friends' houses. Brandon? No, his house looked more like a college dorm. Maybe Marcus, his brother? I called Marcus, trying to sound nonchalant. Hey, is Troy with you? I asked. No, haven't seen him, he answered with a slight surprise in his voice. I lied, pretending that everything was fine, and quickly ended the conversation. Later, when Troy finally called, I picked up the phone almost instantly, but decided not to show how much I was waiting. Finally remembered you have a wife, I began sarcastically. Danielle, he said in a calm but cold voice, we need to talk. I felt something squeeze inside. I don't want to live with you anymore. I'm sick of the way you treat me. I felt my chest tighten and my breathing became heavy for a moment. Wow, now I'm the bad guy, I said, trying to sound sarcastic, but my voice trembled, betraying everything I felt. The victim role was familiar to me, and I knew how to play it. You're leaving our marriage because of some joke? On the other end of the line, he exhaled heavily. I heard him rub his face with his palms, a gesture he always did when he was at his breaking point. This isn't about last night, Danielle. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. It's all of it together. It's the way you talk to me, the way you act like you're always right. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of trying. My heart started racing. Are you really doing this? I asked, feeling my voice break. Are you really destroying our marriage? No, Danielle. You're the one who ruined it a long time ago, he said harshly, his words hitting me like a hammer. I'm just walking away from this chaos. Goodbye. The connection dropped, and I was left alone, stunned, phone in hand, still hoping he'd call again. But he didn't. I sat there for a long time, motionless, staring at the screen like it would make a difference. Something heavy lodged in my throat, but I didn't cry. I don't cry over things like this. He'll come back. He's always come back. But somehow this time it felt different. I called back. There was a dial tone, then a voicemail. I tried again, but the result was the same. Should I leave a message? No, that would be too much. I scrolled through my contacts to Rachel's name, but stopped. I knew she'd say, You went too far this time. I wasn't ready to hear that. Instead, I was left alone, staring into the void. The next day, something changed. I felt it in my chest, like something invisible but palpable was pressing down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about his words. They played in my head like a broken tune. You're breaking me, making me feel worthless. I'm not going to live like this anymore. Those words wouldn't let go of me. I tried to make excuses, to accuse him of being overly sensitive, but for the first time I couldn't. It wasn't him. It was me. I hadn't called him. Pride wouldn't let me. Instead, I did worse. I published a post on Facebook. It's funny how people think they're victims when they've always been the problem themselves. Stay away if you want, I'm fine. I added selfies to the post, in which I looked like I was about to conquer the world even though I hadn't left the house in 2 days. The comments flowed like a bomb. You deserve better. If he doesn't accept you at your worst, he doesn't deserve you at your best. For a moment, I was relieved, that feeling of being energized by someone else's support, but by nightfall it was gone. The phone was silent. No calls, no messages. It was as if it had vanished. Later that night, I found myself standing in front of our wedding photo on the mantelpiece. I stared at it like it was evidence of a crime. My smile in the photo looked strained, but in that moment I noticed for the first time the tired look in his eyes. It had always been there, but I'd never paid attention. Now, however, it felt like a blow. I sat down on the couch, placing the photograph on my lap. The date on the back, April 22, 2016, was neatly written in marker. I ran my finger over it, trying to convince myself that it wasn't my fault. I was doing everything right. Cooking, cleaning, supporting when he had nothing. I kept everything afloat. But the voice in my head, quiet and merciless, whispered, "You never apologized." I ignored it. I put the picture back up and told myself I didn't have to apologize. He behaved inadequately, ran away like a child. But on the 5th night, I realized I'd ruined everything. The silence was deafening. No calls, no messages, not even about the kids. That was what scared me the most, because Troy had always taken care of them, even in the worst of times. I knew the kids were more important to him than anything else in the world. That's why his silence, his lack of even a brief response, hurt me to the core. My heart seemed to stop beating, as if it no longer existed. I couldn't take it anymore, dialed his number, and when I heard the beeps, I left a message. I tried to sound strong, but my voice betrayed me, breaking in the middle. "Hi. I just wanted to see how you were doing. The kids miss you, so please call if you can." After I dropped the call, I was overcome with contempt. Contempt for how pathetic I sounded, and for how real this whole situation was starting to become. A week passed before a man in a polo shirt showed up on our porch. In his hands, he held papers. Papers. Divorce papers. Like it was a very ordinary day, a Tuesday or Wednesday. Angry, I snatched them out of his hands, slammed the door shut with such force that the frame shook. "Unbelievable," I muttered, tearing up the papers as if that could invalidate what was happening. "He's doing this over some ridiculous argument." My eyes quickly ran over the lines, but I didn't read into it. It all seemed absurd, far from reality. People argue, say things in the heat of the moment, but then they come back. And Troy didn't. A month passed in a languid wait. I convinced myself it was just a ruse, a ploy to get me to make the first move, to chase after him. That's classic Troy. But one day, late at night, I sat with my phone, lazily scrolling through my Facebook feed, and suddenly came across a picture. There she was, some girl named Leanne, a fragile blonde, the kind of girl who wakes up at 5 in the morning for yoga class. I clicked on her profile. Everything was open, like a rookie mistake. Her bio said, "Blessed beyond measure." It made me so angry that I rolled my eyes until I was slightly dizzy. But then I saw the picture. Leanne and Troy. They were sitting in a restaurant. His arm was gently wrapped around her shoulders, and his smile was shining as wide as I hadn't seen in years. Underneath the photo was the caption, "Grateful to this man every day." It was like something in my chest was on fire. I straightened up sharply, feeling rage take over me. Scrolling through every post, every comment, every little smiley face. It was like I was digging my own grave. This woman, Leanne, was living the life I had built, eating the food whose recipes I invented, enjoyed the fruits of my hard work. And he didn't even wait, didn't stop, didn't grieve, just got on with his life. I switched to his page, expecting to see something, a hint of divorce, a single entry about him being single or happy. Nothing, just silence. But that picture on Leanne's page told me all I needed to know. I sat there, gritting my teeth so hard that the pain echoed in my temples. My first impulse was to publish a sarcastic post, something slippery, petty, like sometimes people forget who helped them heal. But I can handle it. I hit publish and watched the likes appear quickly. It briefly gave me a sense of satisfaction, like a little revenge. But close to midnight, I deleted the entry. Not because I regretted it. I just didn't want him to see it. That night, I realized one thing. Troy wasn't testing me. He didn't care. The next day, I dialed my lawyer's number. If he decided to move on so quickly, I would make his path as difficult as possible. I didn't want him back anymore. Not at all. But to deny the fact that I wanted him to feel that pain wouldn't be fair. If I couldn't be with him, I was going to make sure his new, blessed beyond measure girlfriend realized what she'd signed up for. A few months went by. The divorce process was long and tedious. We were dividing not only property, but pieces of our lives, memories, dreams that once seemed eternal. It all turned into useless arguments and cold agreements. I thought it would destroy me, but it turned out to be the opposite. I was starting to feel free. My attempts to mess with him through lawyers didn't ultimately bring me relief. Instead, I felt myself becoming a person I couldn't respect myself. I stopped. No more calling him, no more checking social media, no more trying to pry into his new life. I focused on me. One evening, sitting at home with a glass of wine, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like being angry. I pulled out a piece of paper and started writing a letter. Not to Troy, but to myself. You weren't the perfect wife, I wrote. You didn't listen, didn't appreciate his efforts, didn't consider that he might be tired. But you see it, and that's the first step to being better. I folded the letter and put it away in a drawer. It was my way of bringing closure to this phase. Troy didn't write or call again, and against all expectations, I stopped expecting it. Instead, I took a vacation, went on a trip, and for the first time in a long time, I started smiling just for fun. The world was big and bright outside of our marriage, and I greedily soaked it up. One day in a small cafe in Austin, I met a man. Not like Troy, and not like I wanted him to be. He was himself, funny, a little scruffy, with a genuine smile that immediately drew me to him. We started talking, and it was easy. Without expectations, without the past pulling me back. Troy had married Leanne a year after our divorce. I found out by accident when I discovered an invitation in the mail from a mutual acquaintance to their wedding party. I didn't go, not because I was against it, but because I didn't see the point. His life was his, mine was mine. Now that I look back on those events, I realized that our marriage was a lesson. We were both imperfect, and our breakup showed me how important it is to work not only on the relationship, but also on myself. I'm still learning, but I guess that's what life is all about. And you know what? I'm not angry now. I'm just living. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.